April 2, 1982. Argentine forces invaded the Falkland Islands. Within hours, Britain declared war. Two nations prepared for battle over a cluster of remote islands in the South Atlantic. But in the midst of this brewing conflict, something extraordinary happened. Soldiers on both sides were listening to the same voice, singing the same songs. The voice of Julio Iglesias. How could one man's music transcend the hatred of war itself? The Falklands War lasted 74 days. British and Argentine forces faced each other across windswept battlefields, each convinced of their cause. Yet in the trenches, in the barracks, on the ships sailing toward conflict, radios played the same melodies. Hey, to all the girls I've loved before, begin the begin. Julio's voice drifted across enemy lines like a ghost of peace. Lieutenant James Morrison, British Royal Marines, would later recall, "We'd hear the Argentines playing Julio Iglesias from their positions. Strange thing was, we had the same cassettes in our kit. Made you wonder what we were really fighting for." But this wasn't coincidence. This was the power of a voice that had spent 2 decades deliberately erasing borders. By 1982, Julio Iglesias had achieved something unprecedented in modern history. He was simultaneously the most popular singer in Britain and Argentina. His albums topped charts in London, while crowds in Buenos Aires sang along in Spanish. He had conquered both nations, not through force, but through melody. His success in both countries wasn't accidental. It was the result of a calculated campaign to become truly universal. The irony was profound. Margaret Thatcher's Britain and General Galtieri's Argentina were preparing to spill blood over sovereignty, while their soldiers shared the same musical hero. Julio had become the unofficial ambassador of a war that shouldn't have happened. In Buenos Aires, his concerts had drawn hundreds of thousands. The military junta, despite their anti-Western rhetoric, couldn't deny his popularity. His Spanish songs became anthems of national pride. "Soy un Truján, soy un señor," echoed through Argentine streets as young men marched off to war. The government had tried to ban foreign influences, but Julio was different. He was one of them, a Latin voice that had conquered the world. General Galtieri himself was rumored to be a fan. At state dinners, when foreign dignitaries visited, Julio's music often played in the background. The dictator understood the power of cultural pride, and Julio represented Argentina's ability to export beauty instead of just beef and grain. Meanwhile, in London, his English-language hits dominated the BBC. "Begin the Begin" had made him a household name across Britain. Housewives hummed his melodies while their sons prepared for battle in the South Atlantic. His collaboration with Willie Nelson on "To All the Girls I've Loved Before" was climbing the charts just as the first ships left Portsmouth for the war zone. The British press had initially dismissed him as continental crooning, but his charm offensive had worked. Television appearances, carefully crafted interviews, and that unmistakable voice had won over a nation known for its musical skepticism. By 1982, he was as British as afternoon tea, as Argentine as tango. The war began with fury. Ships burned, planes fell from the sky. Young men died on both sides, fighting for islands most had never seen. The HMS Sheffield sank with 20 sailors aboard. Argentine pilots, barely out of their teens, flew suicide missions against British warships. The world watched as two civilized nations tore each other apart over rocks in the ocean. Yet through it all, Julio's voice persisted, a reminder of what connected these enemies rather than what divided them. Radio operators on both sides reported the same phenomenon. During quiet moments between battles, when the guns fell silent, you could hear music drifting across no man's land. Often it was Julio Iglesias. His romantic ballads seemed to mock the violence, offering glimpses of a world where love mattered more than territory. Captain Roberto Sanchez of the Argentine Navy wrote in his diary, "Last night, we heard the British playing Hey on their ship. The same song my girlfriend loves. Made me think of her instead of killing. Is this what war is supposed to feel like?" The phenomenon reached its peak during the Battle of Goose Green. As British paratroopers advanced on Argentine positions, witnesses reported hearing Julio's La Vida Sigue Igual playing from both sides simultaneously, a surreal soundtrack to senseless violence. The song's title, Life Goes On, seemed to comment on the futility of their struggle. Colonel H. Jones, who would die leading the charge at Goose Green, had been heard humming Begin the Begin just hours before the battle. His men later said it was the strangest thing. Their commanding officer, preparing for what might be his final fight, finding comfort in a Spanish crooner's interpretation of an American standard. But perhaps the most extraordinary moment came on May 21st during the landings at San Carlos Bay. As British forces established their beachhead under heavy fire, Argentine radio intercepted a transmission. A British soldier, thinking his radio was off, was heard singing along to All the Girls I've Loved Before. The Argentine operator, instead of reporting the position, simply listened. Later, he would say, "How do you shoot someone who loves the same songs as your sister?" The psychological impact was undeniable. War correspondents from both sides began reporting on the Julio phenomenon. BBC journalist Brian Hanrahan noted, "There's something surreal about hearing romantic ballads while men prepare to kill each other. It's as if Julio's voice is reminding everyone what they're really fighting for. Not islands, but the right to love, to dream, to be human." Argentine journalist Roberto Herrera wrote, "Our boys sing Julio's songs before battle. The British sing them too. We are fighting an enemy who shares our musical soul. How do you hate someone who loves the same melodies as your mother?" The war's intensity escalated. The sinking of the General Belgrano cost 323 Argentine lives. The attack on HMS Ardent killed 22 British sailors. Each tragedy was accompanied by the strange soundtrack of shared musical heritage. Survivors from both ships would later report that rescue operations were conducted to the background of Julio's voice on portable radios. Medical personnel noticed something remarkable in field hospitals. Wounded soldiers from both sides, when conscious, often requested the same songs. Hey became an unofficial anthem of the wounded. Begin the Begin played in British medical tents, while Soy un Trujan echoed in Argentine field hospitals. The same voice comforting enemies who might have killed each other hours earlier. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a British military surgeon, recorded, "I've treated Argentine prisoners and British soldiers side by side. When Julio comes on the radio, they all stop talking. There's this moment of shared recognition, like they're remembering they're all just boys who want to go home." The phenomenon extended beyond the battlefield. In Britain, families of deployed soldiers found themselves listening to Julio's music as a way of feeling connected to their loved ones. If their boys were hearing these songs in the South Atlantic, then somehow the music became a bridge across 8,000 miles of ocean. Similarly, in Argentina, mothers and wives gathered around radios playing Julio's hits, believing that somehow their men were hearing the same melodies. Music became a form of prayer, a way of sending love across the void of war. The international media began to take notice. Time magazine ran a story titled "The Crooner of No Man's Land." Rolling Stone published an analysis of how popular music was affecting military morale. The New York Times interviewed musicologists about the psychological impact of shared cultural references during conflict. Julio himself remained largely silent about the war during the conflict. He was scheduled to perform in both London and Buenos Aires that summer. The war made both concerts impossible, but it also revealed something profound about his appeal. He hadn't just conquered markets. He had touched something universal in the human spirit. His management received letters from both British and Argentine families, thanking him for providing comfort during the darkest hours. Some British mothers wrote that hearing their sons' favorite Julio songs on the radio made them feel closer to boys fighting so far away. Argentine fathers wrote that Julio's voice reminded them of better times, when their sons sang along to the radio instead of marching off to war. The war's end brought victory for Britain, defeat for Argentina, and grief for both nations. 649 Argentine and 255 British servicemen died fighting over islands that remained as remote and windswept as ever. The victory parade in London was subdued. The defeat in Buenos Aires led to the fall of the military government. Both nations counted their losses and wondered what they had really won. But something else emerged from the conflict, a recognition of music's power to humanize even the most dehumanizing circumstances. Years later, veterans from both sides would meet at reconciliation ceremonies. Invariably, someone would mention Julio Iglesias, how his voice had reminded them of home, of love, of everything they were supposedly fighting to protect. How, for brief moments, his songs had made enemies remember they were human. Captain Morrison, the British Marine, would eventually meet Captain Sanchez, the Argentine sailor, at a veterans gathering in 1992. Their first conversation wasn't about tactics or politics. It was about music. "You know," Morrison said, "I still can't hear Hey without thinking about that night we heard you playing it across the water." Sanchez smiled. "My girlfriend married me when I came home. We danced to that song at our wedding." The Falklands War proved that music could transcend politics, that melody could cross battle lines, that a single voice could remind warring nations of their shared humanity. Julio Iglesias didn't stop the war. No song could have done that. But his voice did something perhaps more important. It preserved the possibility of peace, even in the midst of violence. Military historians would later study the Julio effect as an example of how cultural connections can persist even during active hostilities. Sociologists examined how shared musical preferences revealed the artificial nature of national enmities. Psychologists analyzed how familiar melodies could trigger empathy even toward designated enemies. In the end, the war ended not because of music, but because of military victory and political necessity. The islands remained British. Argentina mourned its dead. Britain celebrated its triumph. But for 74 days, soldiers on both sides had shared something more powerful than nationalism: the recognition that their enemies loved the same songs, felt the same emotions, and dreamed of the same peace. Today, when diplomats speak of soft power and cultural bridges, they might remember the spring of 1982, when a Spanish crooner's voice drifted across South Atlantic battlefields, reminding warriors that they were, first and foremost, human beings who happened to love the same music. The voice that couldn't stop a war had done something perhaps more lasting. It had planted seeds of understanding that would bloom long after the guns fell silent. In a world increasingly divided by politics and ideology, the Falklands War offered an unexpected lesson about the power of music to reveal our common humanity. Sometimes, the most powerful weapons are the ones that refuse to fight.